This is day 204 for Wednesday, July 22nd, 2020, focusing on Isaiah chapters 32 through 34. We have a very brief discussion for today. In Isaiah 32, we see the continued challenge of a wayward people, and Isaiah compares times under God's righteousness versus times of complacency with sin. In verse 1, Isaiah prophesies, saying, "See, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule in justice." In verse 4, it says, "The minds of the rash will have good judgment, and the tongues of stammerers will speak readily with and distinctly." So the idea is that all sorts of folly will be removed, that righteousness and justice will abound when God shows up and God is present in the mind and hearts of the peoples. Now, on the other hand, complacency with sin looks like in verse 6. "Fools speak folly, and their minds plot iniquity. They practice ungodliness, to utter error concerning the Lord, to leave the craving of the hungry unsatisfied, and to deprive the thirsty of drink." There's not taking care of their neighbors. There's a sense of speaking what feels comfortable about God on their behalf instead of speaking what God is calling them to say. Isaiah then calls for the complacent people to repent, since a time is coming when Jerusalem and, in verse 14, the palace will be forsaken, the populous city deserted. All of these things, when you turn away from God, God's blessings kind of turn away from the people. And so that's what Isaiah is referencing here. I believe Jesus comes and teaches a different lesson than what's happening in Isaiah. I don't believe God abandons God's people or God's mercy. But at the same time, Isaiah is very much focused on the punishment that comes with turning away from God. Anyways, regardless of what I think on the matter, Isaiah 33 verse 2 continues on saying, "O Lord, be gracious to us. We wait for you. Be our arm every morning, our salvation in the time of trouble." Those who seek God's ways experience life. In verse 15 it says, "Those who walk righteously and speak uprightly, who despise the gain of oppression, and who wave away a bribe instead of accepting it, who stop their ears from hearing of bloodshed and stop their eyes from looking on evil. They will live on the heights, take refuge. Their refuge will be the fortresses of rocks. Their food will be supplied, their water assured." So instead of the injustice where people don't have food and people don't receive water, the people who trust in God as their rock, who follow in God's ways of righteousness and uprightness, and aren't seeking selfish gain, they will be blessed, provided for. God will take care of them. And may we be able to trust in that God's ways are in fact good ways of justice and peace, ways of tending to the needs of others, and knowing that God and others will tend to our needs due to the sake of our following God. In Isaiah 34, God is also putting enemy nations on notice, using Edom as this cryptic, apocalyptic kind of representative of the outside of Israel. Now remember, apocalypse means just unveiled. It's the idea that there is a veil over something and you remove it. It could be also seen as revelation. And so God is giving this revelation to enemy nations, trying to say in verse 8 of chapter 34, "The Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of vindication by Zion's cause. And the streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and her soil into sulfur, and her land shall become burning pitch." Now in this desolate land, the only inhabitants who will live there are the wild animals. And they will take over this region because humans will cease to live there. All of these things point to turning to God, following in God's ways, and trusting what God has to call us to, the justice and righteousness to live with one another, to avoid war and the acts of war, but also to avoid idolatry, which is the biggest problem in the Old Testament. Idolatry, falling away from God, choosing other gods, and to worship things that feel self-serving instead of that promote life in community. So may we be focused on the ways that we interact. May we be concerned about the justice of our society and take part in that. So look forward to talking more about this in our next Daily Bread Bible Study session.